Hello, this video is going to cover two different topics. One is going to be educational foundations or the history of education. We're going to start with the colonial times, and we're just going to hit some of the main highlights of things you probably want to be aware of, decisions, landmarks, things like that that have affected education as we know it, have helped shape it, and have helped bring about why we do things the way we do them in education thus far. We're also going to talk a little bit about educational theories, and we're going to talk a little bit of the main ones. I'm just going to hit the major highlights. I'm keeping in mind that a lot of them aren't truly educational theories. A lot of them are actually psychological theories or theories of psychology that are involving the way people learn, the way people remember, the way people associate things, and the way the brain works to be able to remember and associate and learn new concepts, which are highly applicable to education, since that is kind of what we do as teachers, is to help students learn and remember content. So hopefully that will give you some insight as to why we teach the way we do, and the beginning of what can be, how strategies can spur from that to be effective teachers. So first in the educational theory is the debate between nature and nurture. And that is something that you'll see underlining just about every conversation that we have regarding education. And so it's probably the most broadest. It's not an actual theory in itself. It doesn't have a specific founder or a specific author, but it is something that is overarching. And it is the question of whether nature or innate factors or nurture, external factors, environmental factors, affect who we are and how we learn. And so on one end is the nature debate. The nature is who we are internally. So we're looking at genetics. We're looking at personality, which a lot of people believe, personality is innate. It is just who you are. You hear the word temperament used. Sometimes that's related to, your parents' education, your parents' knowledge base. Sometimes it's related to developmental stages. So that is all, of course, innate. It's not anything that you as a person really have control over. It's just, it's a born into you factor. On the other end, we have nurture, which is the environment, which is the external effects. And so that is, your home life, your school life, the experiences that you've had, how you're interacting with your siblings, your friends, any extracurricular activities you've had, any external situation, which also impacts who you are and how you learn. Um, so there are debates as to which one has more influence. Very rarely do you hear anymore that one matters and the other one doesn't. It's usually a combination. Yes, people have an IQ that is going to give you some prediction of what they're able to do and what they're capable of, but that's not everything. Also, you have your home environment, your school environment, all the different experiences that you had, and the more enriched your background is and your environment is, then the more likely you are to be successful in, academics. So there are two different, debates going on there, and so it depends on which you feel is more has more control. Do you believe that people are they're just smart or they're not, they're readers or they're not, they're math people or they're not, or do you think it has to do with their perception, their experience, their background knowledge? Did they go to a good school that really fostered that? Did they come from a home life with parents who really pushed that? Is it something that has been fostered to them based upon their external environment, something that they've learned or seen? So for example, let's just say that the liking of school, we'll just say people who enjoy schooling. We'll take that as an example. Is something that is innate? So are people just born with it? Some people are born liking school and some are not. Or is it an environmental thing? Did they go to a school that was fun? That had fun activities? Did their friends like school? Did their parents like school? Was school a priority at home? Was it let's look at it, take it beyond the home level, in the nation that they lived in the culture that they lived in? Was that important to them? Some cultures have a tendency to value formalized education more than others. So did that impact them? So again, we're looking at nature versus nurture. And a lot of this, you'll see theories kind of leaning towards one or the other. some theories that are developmental theories, and a lot of those that are biology based, medical based, have a tendency to be in the nature. So, for example, all children learn to walk and talk and do basic landmark type milestones roughly at the same time. There's a range, but roughly at the same time. So that would be a supporter of the nature, that everyone kind of progresses through this natural development. Others may debate, yes, that's true, but some people, learn to read faster than other students, or some people are more inclined to this type of academics because they were exposed to it early on. Their parents read to them a lot. They had a lot of resources at home. And so that also, we have research to see that as well, that students who are exposed to books before the age of 5, have usually pick up on reading a little bit faster than the others. And so that's more of an environmental or nurture debate. So keep that in mind as you progress through your educational experiences and you look at different theories. Keep in mind, is that coming from a nature standpoint or a nurture standpoint? So another debate, or actually it's not a debate, it's more of a theory that we have, is cognitivism, and that comes from the word cognition, and cognition has to do with thinking. So anytime you hear the word cognition or cognate or something's, or cognitivism, they're referring to the practice of thinking or mental processes. And so cognitivism is an understanding of how the mind works and how it processes and stores information, which of course teachers are going to be interested in because that's kind of what we're trying to do when we teach. They compare the mind to a computer, and they don't belittle it to that, saying the mind's just like a computer. But for you to understand a little bit about how the brain works, you can compare it to a computer. You have your hardware, which is the outside components of your brain. You have the different areas, such as the pictures below. You have your different areas that are clearly, an area that handles your speech, an area that handles coordination, an area that handles vision. But you also have things that you can't really see, that if you were to, surgically open the brain, you can't pinpoint a memory. You can't say, oh, that little brain wave right there is a memory. They can physically point to, this is the area of the brain where taste is. This is the area of the brain where language is developed. So you kind of have your hardware and software just like you have a computer. Cognitivism is different than behaviorism, which is two different types of theories related to learning, because behaviorism looks at the external behaviors, and we talk about that later. That's behaviors that are external to the person. So if you go back to our nature and nurture debate, that is the nurture side of things. Cognitivism is things that are innate, that your brain, that you can't really see, and it's the learning process, which is very difficult to understand because you can't really see it, you can't really touch it. It's a process, it's an abstract concept. So something interesting is that we used to think that the brain's functions were in isolation in different hemispheres. So, like you've probably heard, I'm left-brained, I'm right-brained, which that means I'm more creative or I'm more abstract, and that's not 100% the case. The brain is not 100% compartmentalized like that. The brain is actually highly flexible, especially in younger years. Which means that the brain can take over certain duties. So it's not just this one little section the brain can handle language. And we've seen that in cases to where if someone damages a part of their brain, oftentimes it takes a while, their brain is able to rewire itself, again, using the computer analogy, to take over those processes. And so, we've had people who've been in accidents where they've damaged their frontal lobe, which involves speech. But their brain was able to rewire itself and able to, again, learn to speak, but probably with a lot of therapy, and it does take a while, but that shows that the brain is flexible, and elastic is a term that is often used, which gives us hope in learning that if a student has part of their brain is not, developed properly, or they have been in an accident, all hope is not lost. They can actually, learn through a lot of therapy how to use other parts of their brain. So that is a debate that we've had in the past as well. But keep in mind, the brain is not 100% compartmentalized as we've previously thought in the past. So expanding on from cognitivism, we're going to look at Piaget's stages of cognitive development. So again, we're looking at thinking development, understanding development. This is all brain development, so cognitivism. And Piaget was more of a theorist of the nature debate. So he believed in developmental stages. And so students develop through these discrete stages, and he only did it up to age 15. So, after that point, he only really studied children. But his belief was that we all progressed roughly at the same age. So at any given child under normal development, between ages 0 to 2 would be in the sensory motor stage. If you were 8 years old, more than likely you were in the concrete operational stage, unless for some reason you were highly, highly gifted or you truly had developmental delays. Which might be related to students who had been in accidents or who, brains hadn't fully developed, who may end up having special education services. They might not be in these stages, but the general population would be, because we all progress based upon our biological age. So some of these, if you have children, you can actually think about these and say, yeah, I remember my child doing that at that age. And so that's a lot of where this comes from. So young children, 0 to 2 years old, are in stage 1. They call that sensory motor. Everything's based upon touch. They have to touch everything, which if you've had babies 1 to 2 years old, then you see they touch everything. Also, they do something that is quite interesting, and if you have a very young child at this age, try it out with them. There's called object permanence, and that's when they, on the end of this area, so 2 years old, they begin to realize that something that is out of sight isn't out of mind. So if you take a very young child, 1-year-old, and you have, I don't know, a sippy cup, and then you put it behind your back and you say, oh, it's gone, they really think that sippy cup is gone. It's vanished into thin air. When they get to the more closer to the end of that, you see that they're like, no, you got it behind your back, or they know it's there. They might have not know where it is, but you can see them start to look for it. You can see them, start to look under their blanket and look up behind the couch. They know it didn't vanish into thin air. And also they remember it at that point. Very young children, they can only remember what they are actually physically seeing. As soon as it is taken away, within a couple of seconds, they forget it. But as the brain develops, based upon his theory, they actually do retain, oh yeah, that sippy cup that I had a couple of minutes ago, oh, it's not gone, it's hidden behind your back. So that is object permanence. Later, ages 2 to 7 is the second stage. You go into pre-operational. So that's when language develops. So you see, usually about 2-3-year-old mark, you see language start to rapidly develop. Children start to speak in sentences, and before they speak in sentences, they speak in phrases. It's not just grunts. It's not just one word. They start to use descriptors. They start to say, my fuzzy blanket, not my, I want the red blanket. I don't want the blue blanket. So they start to use descriptors. Also, you notice that students or children at this age are very self-centered. So that's why you hear the terrible 2s, the terrible 3s, because they are very self-centered. They can only see from their perspective or their perception. And that's something that you probably, if you have older children, have to explain. If you have students or children who are, 7 to 15, who are less self-centered, they don't understand why, the baby brother, baby sister is all about themselves, doesn't want to share, right? So 2-3-year-olds, you're struggling with sharing. And that's because everything is about me. And so sometimes that's difficult to try to explain to other children. So if you teach those age levels, and a lot of us will probably end up teaching 7 or under, again, you're gonna be dealing with a lot of self-centeredness, a lot of not wanting to share, and a lot of not understanding people's perspective. So when you actually have a lesson and you're trying to teach a student, let's look at it from his perspective. How do you think he felt about that situation? They're not really able to do it. So a case in point would be reading The Three Little Pigs. So you may say, okay, let's look at it from most people look at it from the pig's perspective. Oh, the big bad wolf was going to eat me. That's scary. Don't like it. Well, we say, let's look at it from the wolf's perspective. He has to eat pigs to survive. That's what he eats. So, yes, he has a motive for doing that, because if he doesn't eat, he doesn't survive. Children of that age would have a hard time understanding that because they can't see it from any other perspective. While we as adults and actually beginning 7 and above are going to be more likely to be able to do that. So just keep that in mind. Those are some characteristics. From 7 to 11, you move into the concrete operational stage, which is the third stage. And at that point, you're able to think more logically. So if you're teaching those age levels, which gets into upper elementary, into middle school, you're able to teach more abstractly. So prior to that, in pre-operational, when you introduce a new concept, you're going to have to use manipulatives. You're going to have to draw it out. You're going to have to really relate it to something they understand, because at that age they only understand concrete concepts. And near the end of that, and that's on through so when you're moving into the concrete operational stage, as you go through that and you're ending with that, they're beginning to think a little bit more logically. They're able to later eventually form into abstract thoughts through the formal operational stage. During the concrete, they're less self-centered, but they're still needing that concrete manipulation to understand. So if you're trying to teach them adding or subtracting, you can't just hold up 5 fingers and take away 3. You're probably going to have to lay out 5 blocks, take away 3, so they can actually see the process. If you're trying to get them to analyze something, you're probably going to use a lot of graphic organizers, things like that, to really flesh out. If you're trying to get them to compare and contrast, you're probably going to use a Venn diagram to actually let them see piece by piece how these whatever concepts are related or not related, similar or not similar, because they're not going to be able to do that just in their brains the way that we as adults do. So moving on from that, if you end up teaching middle school, high school, your students will probably, for the most part, be in the formal operational. So you're going to be able to use more abstract things. You're not going to have to break out the manipulatives for every concept. They're able to understand hypothetical situations, so not real, not actual real life situations that they've experienced. So a lot of times for me, when you're teaching history, hypothetical situations, think about what it was like for somebody in World War I. Think about what it was like for somebody in the Civil War. Before formal operational, they're not really going to be able to, because they can't really see from that perspective, and they have no hypothetical understanding. They don't understand they can't put themselves in a situation of what life is like, other than what life is truly like for them. So that also will affect how you teach. So again, these are different Piaget's stages. And again, his belief was more on the nature side of things, that it's developmental, it's age-based. So based upon your biological ages when you move from these, it's not necessarily environmental. So any student, despite their environment, despite their exposure, are going to be moving through these stages roughly within this range. Now, Piaget was not, the stages of cognitive development was not his only theory. He was actually a major theorist that we use a lot within education. So the next thing is his what we call schemas, which can be a little bit difficult to really understand, because again, it's very abstract. But he defined a schema, any knowledge that we have is placed into schemas, and I compare those to like little building blocks or folders. I like to think of schemas as folders. So we have any knowledge we have to organize it into folders, and as we put more things in that folder, more related concepts in that folder, the folder becomes bigger and our understanding becomes more complex, and our knowledge about that topic becomes more broad, but also it becomes more relative because we're able to relate it to different other folders. And so if you want to go back to the brain comparison that we were using with cognitivism, you would have all these little file folders in your brain, the way that you make little folders on your computer. So you would have all these different ones. However, our brain is very much like a web in that we can connect things. So I have a folder for one concept, and then I have a folder for another concept, and later on I learned that they're somewhat connected. So I make a little connection in my brain to where I can pull from either folder, but I know that they're somewhat the same. Also, it's important to know that sometimes when we learn things, our brain does not put them in the correct folder. And that is highly detrimental, because your brain makes a pathway. And so now if you don't put it in the correct folder, you can't retrieve it. So, if you've ever been trying to remember something, or you've learned something and you're trying to remember how to do it and you can't remember, it could be that, it did not get put into the right little folder, if you will, in the right schema. And so when you're trying to remember it, you can't, because you can't retrieve it from the correct area. And a lot of times students with disabilities have a hard time organizing information and relating it to put in the correct folder, so their brain ends up putting it into an incorrect folder, and they have a hard time retrieving it and remembering things. So, for example, some students are able to, if you teach them a concept or a skill, they're able to do it immediately. As soon as you teach it to them, they're able to do it. 2 or 3 days later, you ask them to do it, can't do it. And you know that they know. You know that they encoded it, that it actually went into their brain, but they can't remember it because it wasn't associated correctly to the file folders. So there are 2 different types. Piaget talked about 2 different types of learning and associations that people make. One is assimilation and one is accommodation, and they're a little bit different. So in assimilation, that's where you take an unknown concept and you're associating it to an already existing piece of knowledge. And keep in mind that this isn't always accurate. So this happens a lot with children, and this is something that I see a lot with usually 1 to 3-year-olds when they're learning when they're really experiencing things for the first time. So, for example, a toddler has 2 dogs at home, and she sees a similar dog at her aunt's house, but the dog is different in size and but it has similar traits, and so she calls it a doggy, which would make sense, and that is a correct assumption. Another one would be, though, that a toddler has 2 dogs at home, and then she happens to see let's say a cat at her aunt's house. She says, oh, in her brain, she's assimilating, and she's saying, well, they're both furry, they both have 4 legs, they're both living in the house, they're pets, so that cat must be a doggy as well. And of course, that is incorrect. That is not accurate. She doesn't know the proper name for it, but she is associating it. She is seeing that the characteristics are similar: 4 legs, furry, has ears, whiskers, whatever, tail, that kind of thing. So they're assimilating it. They're associating a new thing that they haven't seen before, i.e. the cat, and they're trying to make it fit into their brain folder, and she's trying to make it fit in the dog folder, and really it doesn't. She needs to make a new brain folder for the cat, but she doesn't know that yet. So that's assimilation. Accommodation actually happens kind of after the fact, after assimilation usually happens, and that's when the person or child realizes that unknown thing, which is the cat, shouldn't be associated with an existing knowledge, so a new brain folder has to be made. So, for example, again, that could happen with the cat or with the toddler who has 2 dogs at home. She goes out, to a farm field trip, and she sees a cow. And she says, oh, that's a dog because it's got 4 legs, it's furry, it has a tail, right? And her mom says, no, that's a cow, that's not a dog. And then she explains to it, well, it has spots, it's bigger. She's showing why it's different. And the child sees that there's a difference, and now it starts to put in the characteristics of a cow into the cow brain folder versus the brain folder and dog brain folder, and that can also work with the cat as well. The mom says, no, that's not a dog, that's a cat. See the cat say meow versus saying woof, and the child starts to see, oh, that's different, and they make a little brain folder for that and say, okay, so they're accommodating, they're realizing that there's a difference, and they're making a new brain folder there. So they're a little bit different, and they kind of go in order. Normally you'll see a child assimilate first and try to make it fit into what they already know, and then when they realize it doesn't fit, they have to make a change in their brain and say, oh, now I got to accommodate for it, make a new brain folder because it's too different. And we actually do that with everything that we learn. We try to naturally stick it with something that we already know. If when we're trying to go through the characteristics and we say, yeah, this is too different, it doesn't need to go in this folder, it's not close enough, then we have to make a new folder. Maybe they're related, maybe they're under the umbrella of animals, maybe they're under the umbrella of mammals, but they're not the exact same, so they can't go into the same folder. So that, again, highly beneficial to you as a teacher, because that helps us see how we need to teach students and what processes students go through when they're learning. Now, different than Piaget, who again was more of a believer, and his theories focused more on the nature side of things, developmental stages that everyone goes through at the same time, is Vygotsky, who actually, interesting about him, he was Russian, and so his theories, and he was, developing these during the time of the Soviet Union, which things were, of course, very closed in, not a lot of sharing of information. So a lot of pieces of his theory didn't actually come out till after the Cold War ended, which would be quite a while after he actually developed them. He had actually died because he died relatively young. And so a lot of his theories were things that came out, 10, 20 years, if not more, after he had actually developed them because of the climate of the time when he was developing them, with him being in the Soviet Union and all. But so interesting fact about him. So with Vygotsky, he was more on the nurture side, or the environment can influence you side, which a lot of times teachers tend to lean towards, because we believe that we as teachers in our classrooms, in our practices, can influence how students learn and remember. And so a lot of theories of teaching spur directly from this Vygotsky's social development theory. And so again, the real key term here is social. So learning is social. It's something that we do by interacting with others. We don't learn in isolation. We don't lock people up and give them a book and say, learn this, and they truly learn it on an extent that they can really use it and relate it. Now, while they may read about it, people really learn and make meaning out of content by interacting with others, and especially those who know more about that topic than they do, like teachers and parents. So Vygotsky's theory is based on that teachers and parents and those who are more experienced can actually teach and help students learn, which again is what teaching is. So very environment heavy influenced, and this actually was a spur or the beginning of what we consider to be constructivism, which is where people develop their own knowledge through their experiences, which is a key factor of Vygotsky, and a lot of people teach using this and allowing students to develop their own sense of a topic by doing different experiences, which is kind of what you're doing with a lesson plan. You're teaching them a topic, but you're giving them different activities to help them really experience that concept, to really understand it. So doing a science lab is a case in point. We read about, whatever the topic is, but we go in the lab and we actually manipulate it and we experience it for ourselves, and we're building our own knowledge about that content, which would be active learning, is often a term used for within constructivism. So part of Vygotsky's theory of social learning explains how students go about learning, and oftentimes how teachers go about teaching, and how people in general expand their knowledge. And so first of all, the teacher or the person who has more knowledge has to find the student or the learners what we call zone of proximal development, or ZDP. And that's where they can almost do a new thing. So looking at our diagram here, here's the person, here's the things that they can do on their own. So let's say we're talking about a 5th grader who, is learning division. Okay, well, he can already do multiplication on his own. That's something he learned in 4th grade. So he doesn't need help with that. He can do that all by himself all day long. Things that he can do with a little bit of help, maybe he can do his division facts with a little bit of help. He knows his facts, but he's beginning to understand it. And what we really need him to do is to move into this area where, we need to move this way, because here are things that he cannot do no matter how much support he gets. So at day 1 of long division, he's going to be here. He has no idea how to do long division. You have to teach it to him. So you teach it to him. He's moving here. Okay, he's getting a little bit. He can kind of do most of it. But then again, maybe he gets messed up at a step or so. So you jump in and help him here as the teacher, right? Because this is where the learning is taking place, the teaching is taking place. I'm saying, oh yeah, he gets the concept of it, but he missed this step, he missed that step. So that's where we're going to give him help, because the goal is to move him into this, which is where he can do everything on his own, to where he doesn't need my help with long division. He can just do it and move on. And that's when we move on to a new concept. So this is their zone of proximal development, where they can almost do it by themselves. They're a little bit there, but they need more help. And so this, again, is the teaching process. We take them from something they don't know how to do to something they do know how to do by themselves. And a lot of that is done through the act of teaching, through guided practice, through individual help, through tutoring, through those type things. And that's how we move them into the learning process. So, in addition to that, you may be saying, well, how does that person, how does a teacher move them from, not knowing a concept like long division to being able to do it by themselves? Well, they do it through a process called what Vygotsky called scaffolding, which means that the teacher slowly gives the student more responsibility until they can do it on their own. So at first, when we're teaching a concept, it's very teacher heavy. So if you're going to teach somebody long division, more than likely you're going to put a problem on the board and you're going to work it from start to finish and let them just watch you, right? Then, after doing several different examples, you may say, okay, let's do step 1 together. And we do step 1 together, but then I pick it back up and as the teacher do steps 2 through 5. Then we say, okay, now that y'all can do step 1, let's try step 1 and step 2 together. And then I'll still pick it up from 3 to 5 and do it myself. And then you slowly work them in. You're slowly handing it off to them. So and by the end of it, it's student heavy. And at the end, they can do everything by themselves. They don't even need the teacher's help. So you don't just hand it off to them and say, let me show you once and give it to them. You slowly, piece by piece, make sure that they can really handle that one concept. Now, what happens if, I've given them the 2 steps and they're working them on their own, and then at the 3 through 5, I'm still picking up for them. Well, what happens on that second step and they can't do it? Well, I don't hand off the 3rd step, right? I stop there, reteach it, do what I got to do. I don't move on until they can really handle those first 2 steps. So slowly you're handing it off to them and making sure that you're scaffolding very carefully. And so, for example, you may start out with verbalizing the process, telling it to them. Then guided practice, they do a little, you do a little. Then maybe they're working independently and they're using a mnemonic device to where they're, getting some help from you, but they're pretty much doing it on their own to the eventually point to where they're doing it on their own and they're tutoring other students. Now, it's not always that fluid. Sometimes there is a back and forth. So sometimes if they get stuck at something, you take it back, show it to them again, and then give it back to them. So it's not usually, and a lot of times this doesn't happen in one lesson plan or one day. This takes sometimes, depending on how difficult the concept is, weeks or months to where you're slowly handing off pieces until eventually they're able to do it on their own. So from this, you may say, well, how do I know if I'm giving the students too much at one time to remember, if I'm scaffolding for them and handing over, am I handing over too much for them at one time? And so, a general rule that you can use is based upon another theory called Miller's 7 plus or minus 2. And that is that we chunk our thoughts. And so look at over here on the left-hand side, try to memorize this. So it's TIPCATIOS So just look at that very quickly, look at it for a couple of seconds, and then look away and see if you can remember it. And the majority of you are probably not going to be able to, but look over to the right. Because if you chunk them and group them, that series of random letters, as it looks, is actually made up of smaller words. It's made up of tip, cat, iOS, and USA. Look at that for a couple of seconds. You're actually probably going to be able to remember that. Tip, cat, iOS, USA. And that is something that we chunk information together and we're actually able to memorize it. And I distinctly remember when I was in elementary school, one of my spelling words was together, which I thought had way too many letters to try to remember all my spelling test until my mother taught me that it's actually to, get, and her, all 3 separate words, stuck together into one word. And I could easily do that. So our brains happen to chunk things together. And so we have somewhat of a holding tank in our brain, in our short-term memory, and it's usually roughly 7 items. So we can roughly remember 7 things, 7 new things at a time. So this is only new stuff, not anything that we already know that would be considered in our long-term memory. So these are only short things. Now that doesn't mean that we're only limited to 7 isolated things, because we happen to chunk things together. So it's 7 sets of things, so 7 sets of words, not just 7 words. So we chunk things all the time. We chunk phone numbers, right? We don't, we don't just have randomly 9 numbers. We do 3 and then 3 and then 4. And so they all, even when we say them in a pattern, da, 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 we say them in a certain way to help us remember them. We also, aside from numbers and just random letters, we chunk song lyrics, right? We have our verses, we have the chorus. We chunk things together to help us remembering them. So our takeaway for this theory and concept is when you're teaching information, make sure to chunk them together. Associate things that make logical sense to be associated together, because that's going to help students remember more. If you teach just random 7 facts, they're going to only remember 7 facts. If you can combine 3 or 4 facts together into a set, then you can actually get them remembering more because you're chunking them together. Also, as a side note, it isn't always 7. That's where you get the plus or minus 2. It depends on how meaningful the information is. It depends on how much background knowledge they have. So, people who are multitasking, if you're doing more than one thing, you're probably not going to be able to handle as many as 7. You can probably handle 5 new things if you're doing multiple things at once. If the information is highly meaningful, it's highly chunked, and you're really focusing on it, you may be able, to keep up to, 9 things in your head at one time, and to be able to keep them in your short-term memory. But again, the takeaway here is to make sure to chunk information, as I did in this example, because students are able to remember more that way. And also, don't overwhelm students, because keeping in mind, you can only remember roughly 7 new things at a time. And when you're teaching a concept, it's not new to you. You've done it here, there, and everywhere. And the more veteran of a teacher you become, the less you're able to really understand how it is when you're seeing it for the first time. So keep in mind that it is new to the student, so you want to keep it basic, chunked, and as meaningful, and try to relate those brain folders as much as you can. So in relation to that, we talk about bottlenecking. So, when we are in any given area, we are actually able to comprehend more than one set of stimuli. We're not aware that we're doing it often, but just sitting where you are, you probably are actually comprehending more stimuli than you anticipate. So you're hearing my voice, which is noise. You're seeing my screen, which is visual. But then there may be things going on in your environment. You may have external noises. You may have a baby crying. You may have the door ringing. You may have music playing. You may have the television, on. Of course, you're seeing more than just this computer screen. You're seeing your computer, you're seeing probably your notes, you're seeing the couch, whatever you're sitting on. So you're having a lot of stimuli coming in at one time. And so chunking information into groups helps us to kind of keep information together into the correct context. However, if the stimuli, especially the distracting stimuli, becomes too complex, we can't really chunk information and relate it to our prior knowledge, which affects our ability to learn. And so it becomes bottlenecked, and it means that we can't process it, and so it doesn't really get stuck in our brain. We often just let it go. So if you've ever been trying to multitask and you're trying to read something and you look up and you're like, I didn't remember a thing I read, and it could be because there was so much distracting stimuli occurring that you weren't making the proper associations to be able to remember it. So the takeaway here is try not to do too many things at once. And this is also true when teaching. Try to minimize multitasking and try to really focus on, especially when you're learning new information, try to focus on only doing that one thing, because that will free up your senses to really focus on it versus having to contend with lots of different stimuli, which is sometimes distracting and irrelevant to what you're trying to learn in the first place. So this is actually a psychological situation in theory that's not really related to education, but it does have a connection, is Fessinger's boring task. And something that's a little bit interesting, and I'll tell you, it was kind of an experiment. So basically, a group of people or subjects were giving a task, which was considered boring, to poke little pegs in a board. So if you've ever been to Cracker Barrel, how they poke the little, there's a game, but you're poking pegs in a board. And so they were asked to do that. And they were given either $1 or $20. After they did it, they were given $1 or $20, depending on which group they were in, to convince someone else that it was a fun task, knowing it was boring. And then they were asked themselves what they thought of the task. Interestingly, the people who received $1 said that it was actually an enjoyable test, which they were lying to themselves. The $20 people, the people that were given $20, says that it were honest in saying that it was boring. And so that was kind of a interesting thing, right? Because both of them were doing what would be considered a boring task, and the only difference was that some people were paid $1 and some people were paid $20. They were both asked to convince others that it was fun, and then they were both asked what they thought of it. And so the result, after the psychological evaluation of it, the people who were given $1 were determined to feel bad about telling others it was fun if they didn't really think it was fun themselves. So they were convincing themselves or lying to themselves that it was enjoyable. The $20 people didn't really have a problem because they, with not being honest, because they felt like they had been paid a true compensation. So I know that was kind of out of left field, if you will, but if you want to look at what this means for teachers, when we have incompatible beliefs or decisions, that causes us to have what's called cognitive dissonance, which is it's uncomfortable. And I don't know if you can even physically feel it, but for example, when I explained this, if you had no understanding what I was talking about, you kind of got this confusion feeling, this uncomfortable, I don't understand what she's talking about feeling, and that's considered cognitive dissonance, and that applies to learning. So, like, you can imagine for a toddler when they're in the assimilation stage and they have two dogs at home, but they're seeing this cat and they're going, "That's a cat," and their mom's saying, or they're saying, "That's a dog," and their mom's saying, "No, that's a cat." They're going, "No, I'm confused. I don't understand." People who are learning languages for the first time, if someone comes up to you and starts speaking another language and you don't know that language, you're going to have some cognitive dissonance. You're going to be uncomfortable because you're not going to understand what's going on. So often, students are in this stage or going through cognitive dissonance when they're learning, and it's an uncomfortable stage, and we seek to constantly get out of it, which is why when we're uncomfortable and we don't understand something, we seek to get to review it again, to have it explained in another way, because we're uncomfortable, because we're having incompatible beliefs or understandings. So another example of this, again, is the assimilation and accommodation stages, to where the child knows something isn't quite right. They're in cognitive dissonance, but they don't know how, and they're dependent on that teacher, mom or dad or whoever, to help explain it to them. Moving on from that, we have Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is something that you will hear. That's probably one of the most popular theories that you hear a lot about, and it's a theory of human motivation. So what keeps people going, what makes people do what they do, and Maslow believed that people are fully motivated to fulfill certain needs, and once certain needs are full, they're able to move up to the next level. So they're somewhat compartmentalized. So we start at the bottom, which is at physiological needs. Once those needs are met, then the student or person is able to handle or contend with safety needs. Once those are met, they're able to contend with belongingness and love needs. Once those are met, they're able to do esteem needs, and then of course self-actualization is at the top. So we start at the bottom. Now, when usually progress is interrupted, and there's a holdup in one of those areas, and that means that they can't progress to the next area till that is fixed. So, of course, we all start out with physiological needs. We're not concerned with anything else unless our basic needs are met: food, water, warmth, rest. So, for example, when you're hungry, and if you're truly, truly hungry, haven't eaten in days, you're not really able to think. You're not really concerned with how nice you are to other people. You're not concerned if people like you. You're hungry. That's your main motivation. That's what you're the most worried about. If those needs are met, then you're able to worry about safety needs. So you're worried about, having security, having body security, having, physical security. Nobody's going to hurt you, those type things. If you're sure that you're safe, then you're able to go up to having relationships, having interactions with others. Once those are secure, you're able to move up to esteem. So having feelings of accomplishment, confidence, those type things. Once all those needs are met, can you get to self-actualization, which is where the belief is that you have your full potential of being your full self, and having all of your creative interests and activities are able to come into fruition. So a lot of people actually in Maslow's theory never reach self-actualization because they get caught up somewhere in these. And we see this happen a lot. This is something that can be definitely applicable to other teaching situations. If a student doesn't feel safe If they feel threatened, maybe they don't have a good home environment, maybe they don't have stability at home, then they're probably going to have difficult making friends. They're going to have difficulty, really relating to others. So because they have safety issues, they can't reach belongingness. Oftentimes, those students also don't have a lot of self-confidence. They're very meek, they're very unself-assured because they don't have a lot of security. So that affects their self-esteem needs. If a student doesn't have basic, say that they don't have basic stability in their home, so they don't have a good home life, they don't have, what we would consider to be a consistent living area. So that would be physiological. So that if they don't have that, they definitely don't have safety. If they don't have that, they're definitely not worried about making friendships. And if they don't have that, then they're definitely probably don't have a lot of confidence, which means they're probably not learning at their full potential. So how to address that is you have to address it at that level. If I have to address it at the level of getting that student that level of security. I can't jump up there and say, well, maybe I need to teach him some confidence. He's not going to get confidence until he has security. So you have to, work it from its root area. And again, it's from the bottom up there. So now that we've talked a little bit about nature versus nurture, we've looked at the developmental stages of cognitive development or thinking development, which again is on the nature side of things. We've looked at some nurture. We've looked at Vygotsky. We've looked at Maslow's. We've looked at how people learn, those type things. Now we're going to talk a little bit kind of sort of in the same realm, but not exactly, because we're moving away from cognitivism and thinking to moral development. So we have Kohlberg stages of moral development, and the term stages in development should tip you off that this is probably going to be a nature-based thing, that you're going through different levels. They're concrete. They're predictable based upon, moving from one stage to the other. So this is a internal thing. This is not, this is a nature thing versus a nurture thing. So he believed that he expanded actually beyond Piaget's theory of moral development and developed somewhat of his own. That there are 3 levels of moral development, and each, and again, this is mainly focused with children on into adult. It begins with children, goes into adulthood, of how people develop their morality. So we start out in stage 1, which is obedience versus punishment. And so for those of you that have young children, you might have seen this actually in real life situations, to where children will do what is right based upon what is punishable or not punishable. So, they say, well, I know I'm not supposed to have a cookie before dinner, but if mom doesn't know and I won't get punished for it, she'll just, she won't say anything, then I'll do it anyways. But if I'm going to get punished for it, I don't like punishment. Children don't like punishment. Nobody likes punishment. Then I won't do it. So it's a matter of what is going to be punishable and if I'm actually going to get in trouble for it. Moving on from that is individualism and exchange, or what brings reward. So beyond what is punishable, am I going to get a reward for it? So as students get a little bit older, they're like, I really don't want to do my homework, but I know that if I do, I'll get a reward of getting to go out to recess, tomorrow. So they're not doing homework because it's the right thing to do, because they want to learn, because, they may use that content later in their careers. No, they're doing it because they're getting a reward. So it's very, if you can see in these 2 stages, it's very concrete. We're doing it because we're either going to get punished or reward. We don't see the lasting effects at this point. So that's conventional morality. So level 2, we move into a little bit more conventional morality, a little bit more abstract, not as concrete punishment or reward. We do it because of relationships. So what pleases others? And you see this happening a lot with early, middle elementary, upper elementary students. We see this happening a lot with, first, second, third, maybe 4th-ish grade. You see students being people pleasers. So I'm going to do my homework because I want my teacher to be happy for me. I don't want my teacher to be disappointed in me. I want my teacher to give me praise. So I'm wanting to please my teacher. I'm wanting to please my mom or whoever. And that's why I'm doing it. It's not necessarily that I'm afraid I'm going to be punished, or not necessarily doing it for a reward. I'm wanting somebody to be pleased with me. So that's stage 3. Moving on to stage 4, it's a maintaining of social order. So it's not so much anymore that I want to please somebody, it's that I respect them. So that they are my teacher, I'm going to do what my teacher says. I'm gonna do what my principal says because they are somebody in authority. I'm gonna do what my parent says because they are somebody in authority. So again, usually upper elementary school is where this is gonna hit. Middle school, high school is when you see that doesn't usually work anymore. When you hit high school, punishments and rewards are iffy with them. Usually they're not people pleasers as much anymore, and again, they start to question authority versus necessarily just accept it and respect it. So then you start moving into the post-conventional morality, which one is the social contract and individual rights, which again, the green things are just their names. So really it's the blue and purple that are really helping you understand what they mean. But at that point, people start to learn that there can be an exception to rules. So we have these rules, but there can be an exception to a rule. So case in point, speeding is against the law. We should not speed when we're driving. Is there ever an exception to it? Well, yes. If someone's hurt and you're trying to get them to the hospital, then maybe speeding is okay. So there are exceptions to rules. Then the last is the universal principles, that some people have personal ethical principles which relate to exceptions to rules. And so beyond there being somewhat universal exceptions to rules, there may be personal ethical principles. And so, for example, cheating and lying may be things that fall into this category. So, we may say, okay, is there ever, lying is wrong. We all, generally accept that. Are there exceptions to those rules? So in stage 5, are there times when lying is usually socially acceptable to be okay? Yes, maybe to avoid hurting people's feelings. However, beyond that, you'll have some people who have a personal ethical principles who say, no, it's never okay. Yeah, it may hurt their feelings, but lying is lying. So you have what's generally 100% always, acceptable, and then you have some that, there's some exceptions, but then you have some that are more on a personal level as well. So you see, we moved from being punishable, only worried about what I'm going to be punished for, what my reward's going to be, all the way up to almost having your own moral, ethical, innate principles that may or may not fit with society or what is acceptable. So we move from various stages. And again, that is usually done through age, and that is usually done through stages, so more developmental than experience. Excellent. Now we're moving on into behaviorism, which again is not about thinking, it's about seeing what we're doing. So cognitivism was, again, about thinking, things that we can't really see. We can't see people's thought processes. But now we're looking at behaviorism, or what we can be trained to do. So behaviorism is all about behavior, what we can actually see. If we can't see it, then behaviorism doesn't really accept it. So behaviorism really doesn't accept cognitivism because you can't see it. So we're going to talk about Pavlov's classical conditioning, and if you have taken a psychology course, you probably have run into this, and this is considered classical in that it's very much a staple of behaviorism. So what Pavlov did is he had some dogs, and what he did is he trained these dogs to be conditioned. And the question is can we do that with humans? And actually we can, but is it ethical, number one, to do it with humans? And how does this relate to teaching? In that you can train students to do things, and sometimes we do train students. And if you start to look at behaviors, especially with how to act correctly, if I want students to act a certain way in my class in terms of classroom management, a lot of times we do condition them. We train them using behaviorism. So what happened in this experiment, in this training, in this training series is Pavlov knew that dogs naturally salivate, or they slobber, when they see food. And we know this because we slobber when we see food. No, I'm just kidding. We do it because, that's a natural thing. They like food. They want food. They salivate when they see food. So that's a natural thing, not anything that we did to really mess with that. That is just a natural thing. Also, dogs don't naturally salivate when they hear a bell ring, because that has nothing to do with their internal food principles. I mean, it's not a natural thing. So those were the two givens. So what Pavlov did in his experiment is he would ring a bell, and then he would show the dog some food, and that would cause the dog to salivate. So he did this over and over and over. Ring the bell, show the food, dog salivate. Ring the bell, show the food, dog salivates. Ring the bell, show the food, dog salivates. So he was training him. He was conditioning the dog. So eventually what he did was he would just ring the bell, and the dog would salivate. So he skipped it without even seeing, the dog would start to salivate without even seeing the food. And what the dog had done is he had learned to associate that bell ring with seeing the food, which would cause him to salivate. So that he trained the dog to ring the bell and to salivate from that. And so that is something that it's training, really. It's conditioning. And we do that. We train students through these types of processes. And also, you can uncondition them. So if he continued to ring the bell but never gave the food, and he did that over and over and over and over, he can untrain the dog to not salivate when he hears the bell. So this led way into what is later called Skinner's, who is another theorist, his operant conditioning. And that eventually leads into what we talk about or what we talked about before, which is positive reinforcement and punishment. And so what becomes the staples of a behavior management system. And again, it's based upon behaviorism and conditioning. All right, now that you've had probably your fair share dosage of educational theories, and again, those were just some of the main ones. There are plenty more, but those are some of the main ones that will help make sense as to why we think about education the way that we do. Now we're going to hop a little bit over and look at the history of education. Which is somewhat related to some of the theories, and of course the theories were part of the history, but we're just going to hit some of the high points to help us understand how we've come to be who we are as an institution now. So beginning way back when, some of the very beginning origins of education and where the idea of teaching and learning came from. The Romans, back in ancient Roman times, were very focused on behaviorism and behavior management and practical knowledge. So they were focused more on making sure people had the basic knowledge and skills they needed to survive. As from that came Middle Ages, and that is when content began to be divided into subject areas. So that's when you started to see, reading and math and science start to differentiate and divvy out. Before then, it was all just one big lumped practical knowledge. Also, of course, during the Middle Ages, the churches were the main teaching body at that time. So the majority of people who were literate were somehow involved in the church. That's where the monks were often some of the only ones that could read, and so the main teaching and practices were rooted in the church. So during Reformation, became the belief system that all people should learn to read and to be able to understand the Bible and its truth. So again, springing from churches, the idea was that okay, everyone should know how to read, because if we're all going to be participating in church activities, we need to be able to read to be able to understand the basis of our life, which of course was their religion. So then moving on into the 17th century, that's when you start to see some experimentation with what is considered a truth. So up until that point, during Middle Ages and Reformation, the truth was just accepted. Now you start to see some questioning of it. That's when you start to see the scientific method come into play, when you start looking at, okay, we're going to come up with a hypothesis, we're going to test it, we're going to come up with a conclusion, we're going to do it several times over, and we're going to come up with a theory. Until then, whatever was already pre-established was just pretty much accepted. So this is when a lot of creation of new content was made, because a lot of people were beginning to experiment and come up with their own theories and ideas. Moving on into the 18th century, that's the first time teachers started having special training. So up until that point, teachers were just kind of apprentices. But up until in the 18th century, that's when you started having special training to become a teacher. And it wasn't until the 19th century that public school became mandatory. So up until that, all of these centuries before, it was mainly those who were wealthy, or mainly those who had access or lived in areas where that type of training and schooling was offered. It wasn't something that was mandated or even offered. And things like kindergarten and lesson planning and things like that become more specific and something that's actually offered. Before then, education wasn't really formalized. So beginning, not very formalized at all. It evolved over time, making it mandatory and more of a system than just something that was kind of practiced. So moving on into colonial America, so we're talking, when Puritans and Pilgrims, or when Pilgrims came over and Puritans were, the main group of people there in America. So we're talking the beginnings of colonization. The Puritans' motivation for education was to make sure everyone could read the Bible. Of course, the Puritans group were very religious based, and so they felt like education was a means to serve their religion, which was their whole purpose of life. So they believed that all children should learn to read because they needed to read their Bible. And a law that was actually put into place was the Massachusetts School Law of 1642 and the Old Diluter Satan Act. And that law was passed to ensure that all students attended school and that teachers were available. So that was kind of the first time in America that we see the precedents that yes, everyone will attend school, and yes, we're going to make teachers a priority. Now, in the southern colonies, which of course this has happened in Massachusetts. So in the southern colonies, there was more of a land divide, and there were more wealthy families were attending school, and the structure of the school was around the farming. So that's how we kind of got into what is summer break, what is, when do we go to school. So only when the crops were not in harvest would the students go to school. And oftentimes it were only those who could afford it, the wealthier families. So even there was a divide of how education was handled in the northern states, such as Massachusetts, versus the southern states. The first textbook was called a horn book, and this is kind of an example of what it looks like. It actually wasn't a book at all. It was kind of like a little pad that had a handle on it, and it had the alphabet on it, and it was laminated onto a wooden pad, which was called it was made from a cow's horn, and that's why they called it a horn book. So again, it had the basic alphabet. It had the Lord's Prayer on it, which was typical because again, education was a means to serve religion at that point, and it was almost like a little paddle that they carried around. That was their first textbook. Early into the 1900s, we graduated to what is called the McGuffey Reader, and those were different little books, and some of them were there was a foundation book, and as you got to older levels, they would differentiate into spelling and math and that kind of thing. But they were tiny little books like this, and a lot of them focused on character education. So a lot of them began to move a little bit from the biblical stories per se, and start to move into still general character education, because a lot of biblical stories do have character education basis in them, but they were a little bit more universal at that point, and really focused on, a lot of times would use biblical stories, but really focused on the character development there. So within the 1800s, a couple of landmark things that happened during that time: kindergarten was invented. So up until that point, students didn't really go to school until they were first grade, but kindergarten was invented by a man named Froebel, and he decided that kindergarten was needed because students needed to focus on their motor skills and creative growth and play before they were asked to meet the intellectual demands of elementary school. So what was happening before is students would come from being at home and playing and doing kind of more or less what they wanted to do into pretty intellectual demanding first grade or elementary school. So there was a kindergarten that was developed that focused on making sure students had the motor skills. So being able to hold, with their hands, the pencils, the crayons, the scissors, that type of thing. And really the focus was more on play. So not so much sit in a desk and listen. It was more investigate this through centers and playing. And growth that way. So actually kindergarten nowadays is actually not like this. That's more or less pre-K now. But it was very center driven, very development of motor skills, more play than what what we would consider elementary school now. Also, this is when normal schools were developed, which were teacher preparation programs. So this was the first time that we saw, a lot of formal training of teachers based upon how to teach, strategies to teach, the means behind teaching, that kind of thing. So, two key people who helped evolve that beginning colonial times, 1800s idea of education. One was Benjamin Franklin. He was one of the main people leading a switch from the very religious-based schools to more academic-based schools. So, schools where the focus was solely on teaching a religion and focused on biblical stories, to more of a secular academic, what we're used to now with more subject area type things, with more practical skills. Versus only going to school to learn to read the Bible and to learn what it says. Also, Benjamin Franklin was responsible for developing a school that allowed students to choose their own course of study. So similar to what we have like in college now, and letting them have some say. And during his time, he really pushed the issue of having secondary schools or high schools. Before, it was mainly students would go in grammar schools, learn the basics, and then you were done. No one really went beyond elementary schools. Horace Mann was also another key figure in this, and he was one of the main people to, first of all, develop the first state school board. And he was also one who was able to get property taxes, to be used to support the school system, which gave back to the community. So he was able to convince that giving money to the school was actually giving back to the community. So it was almost a process to where community gives to the school through taxes. The school gives educated people who are able to hold jobs and help the community. So those were some of Horace Mann's contributions. So now we're just going to take a little segment out and talk about African American education. This kind of starts where we were a few slides ago in the colonial times, but takes you back up to the civil rights, because I wanted to put it all on one screen so you can see the progression. But in colonial South, of course, slavery was rapid, and during that time, it was actually slaves were not they were purposely not taught. They were purposely not educated, and they were purposely not taught to read and write. Because there was a fear that if they did, then they could outwit, the slave owners. And actually teaching slaves at that point to read and write was considered a crime. So, you had a lot of no consideration during the colonial South. Now, in the colonial North, slavery, of course, wasn't in place, but schools were still segregated in the colonial North. And there was the conversation of desegregation started in 1846 with different petitions being filed in the North. And so to me, that's a huge point to be made, is that, this idea of desegregation, or this conversation of desegregation, started back all the way in 1846, and look how long it took us to actually do it. So moving forward in 1896, you had Plessy versus Ferguson, which is a landmark court case to where there was the separate but equal facilities. So with Plessy versus Ferguson, the ruling was that schools and public facilities could be segregated as long as they were equal. However, the cultural understanding and the real world understanding was that there was no way they were equal. By law, we said that they had to be separate but equal, but we all know that they weren't equal, that the school, the restaurants, the schools, the whatever that served the white population was usually better, had more resources than the African American population, which is unfortunate and unfair, but again, that was the court case at that point. Moving on further, so we went from 1896 to 1954 before we had another major landmark. In 1954, we had the Brown versus Board of Education, which was the ruling that the segregation of schools and public facilities was unconstitutional. That's it. All it said was it was unconstitutional. It wasn't right. That's all it did. It didn't do anything. It wasn't until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, so we're talking a decade later, is when segregation was actually banned in public facilities, and that's when you started having the movements of actually desegregating. So we went from 1846 all the way until 1964 for these for the process to actually start. So again, those are some landmark court cases. Again, Plessy versus Ferguson saying it's okay to be segregated as long as they're equal. Brown versus Board of Education saying no, segregation is unconstitutional. To 1964, it actually being banned, and even then, it wasn't completely banned. It took a while. People drug their feet before before schools and public facilities were actually desegregated. So middle school is kind of an afterthought. Of course, grammar schools were first, and then you had secondary schools, which Benjamin Franklin kind of pushed into existence. But there really wasn't a transition period. So junior high school, and you may hear older people call middle school junior high. That was what was developed. Again, it was pre-high school, so junior high school was designed to be a transition. The first junior high school happened, and it was later called middle school. It actually was created and first put in place in Berkeley, California, and it is actually typical of what we're used to seeing now, the 6-3-3 model. So the first 6 grades were in grammar school, the next 3 grades were in junior high, and then the last 3 grades were in high school. So similar to what we see now, a little bit different. We typically have 4 grades in high school, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th. But, roughly speaking, that is how those were broken up. So now we're getting into the testing movement, which you will see being something that's underlying since 1904 into current times. We're still somewhat in a testing movement. We still somewhat in public schools have an obsession with testing. But it all began in 1904 when schooling became mandatory for all students in France. So it actually started in France. And within the French public schools, it was decided that all students should attend school. However, when that was decided, the question was, are all students intellectually capable of handling the educational rigor? Are they all smart enough to go to school and able to handle it? Since before, we only let the people who had proven themselves smart or had wealthy parents were able to go to school. Now that everybody's going, what are we going to do about this educational rigor? So a person named Binet developed, and you've probably heard of this, Binet developed the IQ test, or the intelligence quotient test. And the whole goal, the only purpose, was to be able to determine the likelihood or a prediction of whether a student would be successful in school. So the student would take the IQ test. Based upon their score, you'd be able to say, yeah, they're pretty much going to be able to survive, the educational rigor or not. So it was a predictor test. Now, from then, it caught on like wildfire, and a lot of people started using it, including America. And even now, we still use IQ test to try to predict if someone's going to be successful in school or not. As teachers, we have to critically evaluate these things. So our question is a test to predict success in a school really a test of one's intelligence? So again, the IQ test was just created to see if they're going to be successful in school. It has now bombshelled into saying, well, if you don't have an high IQ on your IQ test, then you're dumb. That's not really what it was designed for? And are those two different things? Being able to be successful in school, number one, it's a predictor. It doesn't even mean that they were successful in school. Predictor of being successful in school versus their intelligence may be two different things. And if we look at intelligence in terms of Gardner's multiple intelligences, which is what we've discussed, there wouldn't be a one test that you could take to be able to determine that. And just because one person isn't smart in one type of intelligence doesn't mean that they won't be successful in others. As we've discovered with multiple intelligences, you usually have 1 or 2 or 3 that you're really strong at, and then the rest you're mediocre at. There's not one dominating intelligence that we all must either have or have not. So that's something to keep in mind with the intelligent quotient. There's only one score. It's a predictor. But then again, you have to critically evaluate that, because is that really able to determine someone's success or how smart someone is just in general? Can we even say that someone is smart in general? Is it that we're all smart in our own little facets, which is what multiple intelligences is? So case in point of the unfairness and the bias of the intelligence test, when America began actually using the intelligence test during World War I, they used it with the soldiers, the military soldiers, to see who could be assigned advanced tasks. So they would give it to them. The ones that scored the highest were, often given the more advanced tasks. They often ended up being the ones that got promoted. So then we expanded it beyond that, and we started using it on immigrants to test their intelligence. Interestingly, thing that we found was that that those who are from the immigrants from Western Europe, which Western Europe is more like America, the culture in terms of the culture, scored better than those that were from Eastern Europe, with the culture and the language being very different than the American language and the American culture. So having said that, is that an obvious sign that the test could possibly be culturally biased towards those like Americans? So if the Western groups scored better and it's written for Americans, or French, which would be Western Europe, does that mean that they were biased, and if in that case were they even valid? So to continue on from that, do we still end up creating tests that are culturally biased or unfair testing? Do we unfairly test minorities or those from various backgrounds? So the tests that we create, are they based upon the knowledge that someone living in America their whole life would know versus someone who didn't even grow up in America? Do we use terms and words and phrases that only Americans would know versus things that would be an unfair advantage to someone or a disadvantage to someone who wasn't raised in America? And again, can anybody's one intelligence be determined into one score, or they're very different facets, such as with multiple intelligences? So at the end of World War I, high schools began to broaden their idea of what education was meant to do. Because before then, really beginning with colonial times, the focus was mainly on preparing students for college. And so, after of course, to begin with, it was to help students read the Bible and understand religion. Then with Benjamin Franklin in the colonial times, it moved more into helping students prepare to go to college. At the end of World War I, we saw a branch off from that, and we started to see where education was being used to develop to make sure people have a good life. And so those cardinal principles included things like health, making sure people understood how to keep themselves healthy. Vocational type things, so technical college, so that would be what we would consider to be welding and construction and using technical type things, so things that we would typically go to a technical college now to do. Educating students on how to be good citizens, homemaking, ethical characters, things like that had kind of been pushed to the side because those weren't considered academic areas, were actually finding their way back into the educational system. Because of that, the courses were expanded, and now you can see, and we'll talk about this as you go through the different slides, you'll see that we have a tendency to swing back and forth from this. Sometimes we're very academic, only teach the basics, only teach reading, math, social studies, and science, only prepare students for college. And then the pendulum will swing back to where, no, we'll teach how to be a good citizen, health, teach the whole student, not so more worry about prepping for college, not so worry about testing, moving on that side. So you'll see we'll get moved back and forth. So during, right after World War I, we just so happened to be here with expanding course offerings, offering a lot of not necessarily traditional academics. So next we go into the progressive education. So this is this is into the 1920s and 40s. And again, we moved into the focus of education being more practical and focused on individual development and having more diversity. So students are able to actually, have some more say-so in what they learn in education, and have the education was more practical and more appropriate towards getting a job and that kind of thing. So less of a focus on the classical subjects that we're used to teaching. However, at that point, some began to argue that school was less rigorous and that students were not prepared for their future to help keep America as a world competitor. And so, again, you're always going to have people complaining. So while there was a lot of individualism, a lot of practical knowledge, a lot of more pathways for students to look into, people were complaining, well, because you're not focusing on those classic reading, math, science, and social studies areas, America, maybe is losing its place as a world competitor in those areas. And then we had something called Sputnik. In 1957, for those of you who, I don't know if any of you were around, or for those of you who might have been might be history buffs or majors. In 1957, the Soviet Union beat America in becoming the first country to launch a satellite into space, which was Sputnik is its name. So until then, Americans believed that they were the leaders in science, technology, and innovation. So we had kind of had this precedent setting of us that we were the best in terms of academics, education, science, technology. We were always the innovators. We were number one. And then all of a sudden, the Soviet Union beats us into putting something into space. It's almost like a as you were sleeping type situation. And so many people that further spurred the conversation that America was losing its competitive edge, and a lot of it was pointed at education. So right after that, the National Defense Education Act of 1958 gave funding to improve the quality of education, and surprise, surprise, the pendulum swung back to curriculum being reformed to be focused on the subject area, again, of reading, writing, math, and science, a focus on preparing students for college, and a lot of the academics, the curriculum was designed through subject area experts. So people who had, doctoral degrees in math, in science, in technology. So you're written by highly educated people writing the curriculum. And again, spinning back into the classical subjects, limited scope of what we're teaching, not a lot of practical knowledge, but a lot of in-depth on a very few subject areas. So again, let's take just a time out and revisit what we're seeing this trend happening. So the direction and the decisions of education, as you've seen, we talked about, over the past couple of slides, are often a pendulum. So they swing from one extreme to the other. And a couple of pendulum type things you see going on in public education is one is the local school level of control versus the state federal control. So at some periods in school history, you see there being a lot of local and school level control, the principals having the say, the teachers having a say, and then it will swing right on back to the state and federal government having more of the says. And right now, we're very much controlled by state and federal government. Right now, teachers on the school level, principals on the school level actually have very little say. It's very state and federal controlled. Now, you'll hear veteran teachers say, well, it'll change again, the pendulum will swing back, and it will swing back eventually to local and school level. So it's this constant motion of going back and forth. So if you're in education long enough, it'll change. So another is the standards that we teach, the curriculum that we teach. At one point, one side of the pendulum will always be the set standards, and then that are designed by the state and federal government, that are given to you, very rote, very specific. Moving back on the other side of the pendulum is the teacher created, so that those that allowing teachers more freedom to teach what they want. Right now, it's very state federal set heavy standards. There's not a lot of teacher created freedom in teaching what you want to teach right now, but again, maybe the pendulum will swing back. There's strict evaluation systems versus non-strict. One side of the pendulum, sometimes there'll be some very strict evaluation systems, and then there will be some non-strict. Right now, we're at some very strict, highly developed evaluation systems, but again, in the future, it could swing back. Another side of the pendulum is the demands on teachers. Right now, there's a lot of demands on teachers. Eventually, however, if there are so many demands on teachers, that causes the teacher shortage, and then we stop being so demanding of teachers, and then the pendulum will swing back and forth on that. And then, of course, what we're seeing right now through our history lesson is sometimes in history, there's a focus on academic subjects and rigor, and then sometimes in history, on the other side, is the individualism and student choice, which is kind of like the progressive movement, where students are able to have more choice and we're more open to different areas, technical, citizenship, those type things, versus those core academic areas. Right now, however, the pendulum just so happens to be on the side of the academic core subject areas, that the focus, again, overwhelmingly in public schools is reading, writing, math, and science. And so eventually maybe we'll spring back to more character education, more social studies, more freedom to choose what we want to study. But right now that's not the case, and we see that happening back and forth in education. So case in point, during the 1950s to the 1970s, we see the pendulum swing back again. You see it back to academics, and this is because of what happened with Sputnik, in that in that, the focus was on the academics, the basic subject areas. Now, there were problems with that. Number one, not everyone was motivated to learn those academics. A lot of people wanted a vocational education. They didn't plan on going to college. So, they wanted to learn the technical skills, get out and get a job. Also, the curriculum that was redesigned after the fallout of Sputnik was designed by experts who, knew a lot about these subject areas, and it was a lot of times over the top for the students, the lay public, and the teachers. So there was a hard time understanding the curriculum because of who it was designed by, which is something that we have to keep in mind now, because some even say that the standards we currently teach by now have been designed by experts, and sometimes they're a little bit over the top for teachers and the lay public, as well as young students. So during the 1960s and 70s after this was a time of a lot of social unrest. So if you're familiar with what was happening during the 1960s and 70s, the Vietnam War was going on. There was a lot of opposition to that. There was a lot of the fallout of all these years of segregation was occurring. So, there was a lot of racism going on. There was a lot of social unrest in the civil rights area. There was also a war on poverty going on. And so with all these things happening, students wanted education to be real world. They wanted it to help them solve these social problems. They were not interested in reading math, science, and social studies. They were interested in how to solve these social unrest problems that were occurring. So we go back to the progressive movement, back to a more humanistic side of education, back to more individual, back to more broader choices of subjects. So again, pendulum swinging back at the end of the 1970s in response to what was happening during the culture and the history of that time with a lot of social unrest. A couple of lasting impacts in terms of education, though, and what we still see coming into play today from the 1970s was, number one, special education. So during the 1970s, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was passed, and that really got the ball rolling for the special education services we have today for students. So a couple of things that came out of that. Number one was that students with disabilities have rights, and before that wasn't really the case. They cannot be denied an education. So before we could kind of put them in a special school or kind of say, oh, they're not up to par, so you're going to have to do something else with them. Now we cannot deny students with any type of disability their right to an education. It also passed that we have to accommodate those students and put them in the least restrictive environment, meaning that we're going to try to put them in a regular classroom as much as they possibly can be in. We're not just going to stick them in a special school and say, oh, they learn differently, so they've got to go into another school. No, it's only in extreme cases are they going to be not put into the regular classroom, and they have to show that they're not able to be in the regular classroom to do that. There was a focus more on inclusion, so putting students in the regular classroom versus putting them in separate schools. Now, because of all this, and because this is a little bit of a stark change from what teachers were used to, they felt unprepared. They had not been trained to teach students with different types of disabilities. So a lot of times there was, a little bit of pushback from that. Also, schools had to learn. Schools were being responsible to pay for the services that the special education offered, which was only funded partly by the state. So that kind of was very difficult during the 1970s, that you were told you have to accommodate these students, and by the way, you have to pay for it. We're only going to give you a certain percentage of the budget to do so. So that made it difficult. Similarly, bilingual education was being pushed. From all this, however, specifically the services being paid for on the local level, property taxes were increased because there was a need for funding for all these mandates. And that caused an uproar and a lack of support for public schools during this time. Then something happened in the 1980s that caused the pendulum to swing yet again back. So in the 70s, of course, at the end of the 70s, 60s and 70s, you had the individualized education. You had people having more of a say in what they want to do based upon the culture of that time and what was happening during that time. However, in 1983, an article called A Nation at Risk came out. And that was a report that compared American students to international students. So, non-American students, European students, Asian students, that type of thing. And the data from this showed that students in other countries scored higher on standardized exams. And so that rampant fear, very much like Sputnik, said, oh, we're not number one in competition anymore. Students are scoring higher in other schools or in other countries, so they must be smarter than our students. So that led to a push again to get back to basics, back to the basics, back to the academics of reading, math, science. And again, all students must go to college prep or be college prep, that mindset. So, but when we think about that, let's think a little bit about A Nation at Risk and look at the validity of that article. Number one, let's think about the comparison. Number one, were they the same test? Were the American students getting the same test as the Asian students? What standardized exams were being used there? Number two, did all students attend schools? At this point, all American students were attending school and all students were being tested, even those in special education, because again, special education students had been streamlined and included. In other countries, not all students go to school, and oftentimes not all students are tested. Only those that are tested are the brightest. So if the entire American population was being tested versus only the brightest of another countries, of course their scores are going to be, higher. You're comparing apples and oranges there. You're not comparing all. You're comparing all to a subset. Also, were the international students taught differently? I mean, of course, we have our teaching practices here in America based upon our American culture. Were they taught differently? Is it really fair to compare students that were taught very differently? Also, what about the public's expectations of education? In certain countries and certain cultures, education is considered number one, and they sacrifice all for education. We necessarily don't do that. We believe in family values. We believe in extracurricular activities. We don't always sacrifice everything for education the way other countries do. Which doesn't mean that the students are smarter. It means that they're different. So can we really compare different countries' scores when when all of this is not consistent? There's a lot of diversity among students other than just their scores. But again, that article, which is questionable, the data is questionable, led to, again, the pendulum swinging back to a focus on academics, reading, math, science, college prep, that kind of thing. And it's actually we're still on that end of things in current times. So now into the 1990s and into what we consider the current times, which you all have experienced during your times as a student, is what we consider the data-driven era. So everything is about the data, and so education is being run more like a business than ever before, looking at the data, focusing on the data, analyzing the data, and making changes based upon the data. So it's really all about the numbers right now, which the numbers again are student achievement, and the obsession with standardized testing is come into play because we have to have some way to compare students. And so a lot of times it's their scores on standardized tests, which we equivalent to student achievement. That is questionable in itself. Does a standardized test really measure student achievement? So in order to compare scores, we had to have the same curriculum. So from that sprang from the development of state and federal curriculum. So now, versus in the past, we actually have curriculum that was developed by the federal government, which is the Common Core GPS, versus having, curriculum that was decided on upon the local level or school. So you see where this very quickly snowballed. We had an article that said that students in other countries were better and smarter, so then we started to test students more. We decided that student achievement was based upon that test score. Since we had a lot of standardized testing, we had to have the same curriculum, which developed to a standardized curriculum to go along with the test. So you see where this is snowballing. So in 2001, I'm sure you have all heard, there was the development of the No Child Left Behind Act, which was part of the Bush administration. So during that time, part of what came out of that was that students in 3rd through 8th grade would be tested annually on this standardized test. Those scores determined a school's annual yearly progress, or AYP. If schools did not make a certain cutoff on their AYP based upon these student scores, then the school was at risk for being taken over by the state and federal government, and schools were compared based upon their annual yearly progress. So, and of course that affected parents' beliefs about the school because they would go look up their AYP and say, ooh, they're a bad school, even though, again, you were looking at all students, including special ed students, being tested by a standardized test. Spurring from that was the race to the top, which was under the Obama administration, which is not that different than No Child Left Behind. It's under the same umbrella of data-driven teaching. And what race to the top contributed was grants were given to schools who developed common standards, again under CCGPS. They had data systems to help track student progress, and there was grants given to help and the whole motivation was to stop low performing schools. And again, all of that is very similar to No Child Left Behind, with a very much a focus on an obsession with teaching and testing, and a focus again on reading and math. And even then, science and social studies began to fall by the wayside. It was more focused on reading and math. And from this obsession with testing became this idea of teaching to the test, which again is highly controversial to some people. So we're kind of on the extreme end of standardized curriculum, standardized testing, core academic areas, very specific academic areas, which again is very different than the progressive movement that we've had in the past of individualized education, character education, vocational education, that kind of thing. But in time, the pendulum will swing back and we will see something very different. But this is kind of the current area of where we were and the process of how we got to it.